Well, hi there. It is Thursday, and it's great to be with you today. And I hope your day is going well. And speaking of days, did you ever have one of those days when it seems nothing was going right? I think Saul probably had felt that way as his days were moving along because nothing seemed to go right. And I think the theme we find today ultimately is that God's will is indeed done. We even pray that in the Lord's Prayer, Thy will be done. And nothing we can do is going to change that. And we best get inside God's will. And the truth is, since that is the case, the opposite is also true, that we don't have the power to change it. We are not going to be capable of doing anything to thwart what God intends. And I think at the end here, this contrast between David and Saul, as we've talked about a couple of days now, finally plays itself out. When God left Saul because he was impatient prior to battle, uh, it may have seemed at that moment okay. God said that to him, but Saul was probably thinking, well, nothing's really any different right now. However, as events played themselves out, the truth is that in the end, from that point on, everything that Saul seemed to do uh, was either out of his control or just didn't work right. On the other hand, we also find the opposite to be true, that from the moment God anoints David as king, everything David seems to do turns out right, at least to this point. And and really, in the ending chapters here in First Samuel, it becomes even more obvious. I just jotted down a few things here. Uh, First of all, Saul gets no response when he consults God prior to battle, and in chapter 28, verse 6. And then David gets exactly the response he's looking for in chapter 30, verse 8, when Abiathar the priest casts the stones, the Urim and Thummim that we've talked about before. And he gets told that, yes, pursue the attackers and you will recover your family and all your possessions. Saul ultimately uh, gets that witch at Endor to summon Samuel, and only then does he find out that Samuel says, you will be defeated and you and your sons will die in battle. Uh, David ultimately picks up a half-dead slave in the desert, and he gets invaluable information that leads to the rescue of his family and the recovery of his property. It's as though nothing Saul does goes right, and nothing David does goes wrong. Truth is, God will not be deterred. Uh, that's probably one thing that Saul could never finally internalize that truth. He could speak it, but his actions many times did not follow that. David, on the other hand, certainly is not perfect either. But this truth that God's will is to be honored and that it cannot be thwarted was always a guiding principle, I think, in David's life, at least up to this point. And probably to really cement that and prepare us for how David operated was this account of the runner who came to tell David that Saul and his sons were dead after that battle. Probably that guy could have ended up working his way onto David's army as one of the soldiers had he not um, taken the story and twisted it in a way that he didn't realize was going to cause disastrous results for himself. Uh, his account, as we see it, is different from what we saw at the end of First Samuel. And I've looked at several commentators, and they run the gamut. Obviously, nobody really knows. It's all speculation. Some work really hard to try and make the two stories work together. Some say the guy thought he was ingratiating himself to David, and so he for his own reasons, embellished the story a little bit. We just don't know. But that's not the important part of the story. And in fact, to David, as we look through this, whether Saul would have been killed by the Philistines, whether they would have treated him and tortured him and mocked him horribly, that was not the point either. The point ultimately for David was Saul was one of the Lord's anointed, and therefore it is up to God to take his life, not another man. And so at that point, this guy's fate was sealed, and David has him killed. And the reality is, David was just acting out what he truly believed. And we know that to be true because David had a couple of his own opportunities to kill Saul. But because he believed Saul to be the Lord's anointed, even when Saul's trying to kill him, David said, no, I will not do that. And in the end, to put a final exclamation point on Saul's life, David, at the beginning of 2 Samuel, sings a song that he has written, and it's a lament on the death of Saul, a beautiful lament. There's a lot in there that fits that whole idea of someone who's mourning someone they love. But there's a phrase in there, it appears several times in verses 19, 25, and 27 of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. And it's one that you probably heard many use a lot of times, and it's how the mighty have fallen. And David recounts the exploits when he and Saul and Jonathan were fighting side by side, defeating enemy after enemy. And they used to sing songs saying Saul kills his thousands and David killed his 10,000s. Those were glorious, heady times for them. And they were wonderful days. But in the end, ultimately, it's not by our powers, our armies, that we are given glory and fame and everything else. The reality is, it's all by God's doing. And when we forget that, in the end, it all comes to nothing, as was the case for Saul. I guess, for me, it's just an amazing story. And David's is too, and we'll get to that. But here's Saul, one day, out trying to find his father's donkeys, and the next thing you know, he winds up being king, and has some amazing victories in battle, but in the end, dies on his own sword. His son's killed at his side. And I want to make one final comment before we end today, that even as we see God's plan now unfolding even further, we realize it goes beyond the life of Saul, it goes beyond the life of David. And the reality is, I think it's important for us to learn that God's plan even goes beyond us. Certainly includes us, but God sees things in a much different light than we do. David will now officially become king, but only of the tribe of Judah. And as we have transitioned from judgeships to monarchies, we're now going to have to go from kind of these tribal clans ultimately to a unified nation of Israel. And that's kind of where we're going to go as we move into 2 Samuel. So continue reading and get ready for the ride. It's going to be a fun one here in the days ahead. God's blessings.